The icy breath of autumn swept across the desolate plains of Arizona Territory as Yates Vance stared at the empty cupboards of his modest cabin, a hollow feeling settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. It was 1873, and the drought that plagued Granite had turned what was already a difficult existence into an impossible one, especially for a man raising two young children alone. Yates ran calloused fingers through his sun-bleached hair, his once broad shoulders now carrying not just the weight of his own survival, but that of 6-year-old Thomas and 4-year-old Lucy. 3 years had passed since influenza had taken his beloved wife, Margaret, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone in this unforgiving frontier. "Pa, when's supper?" Thomas asked, looking up from the worn wooden horse Yates had carved for him last Christmas. "Soon, son," Yates promised, though he wasn't sure how he'd keep his word. The last of their beans and salt pork had been consumed the previous night, and the meager payment from his latest cattle drive wouldn't arrive for another week. He'd failed at his last hunting expedition, returning empty-handed despite tracking for miles. Lucy sat quietly by the stone fireplace, her small hands wrapped around her mother's faded doll, the one keepsake Yates hadn't been able to part with when selling their possessions to keep the farm running. Her eyes, mirror images of Margaret's, followed him as he moved around their small home, looking for anything he might have overlooked. "How about I tell you both a story while I get things ready?" Yates suggested, buying himself time to figure out what to do. The children nodded eagerly, and Yates launched into a tale about brave cowboys and wild mustangs. All while his mind raced with worry, in the back of the cupboard, he discovered half a cup of cornmeal and a few potatoes that had started to sprout, but were still edible. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He'd go without tonight. His children needed the nourishment more than he did. As Yates began to mix the cornmeal with water to make a simple mush, a knock sounded at the door. Visitors were rare at the Vance homestead, located as it was nearly 5 miles outside of Granite proper. "Stay here," he instructed the children, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door, a precaution born from necessity in a land where law was often as scarce as rain. When he swung open the door, rifle held loosely at his side, Yates found himself looking not at a threat but at a woman. She stood shivering in the crisp evening air, her dress threadbare and dusty from travel, her face gaunt with hunger. Despite the evident hardship she'd endured, there was something striking about her, a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, and eyes that held both weariness and determination. "Excuse my intrusion, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm seeking work in town, but I've traveled farther than expected. Could you spare some water, perhaps?" Yates noticed she carried nothing but a small satchel, and her hands, red and chapped from exposure, trembled slightly as she spoke. He recognized the look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. He'd seen it in his own reflection too often lately. "Come in, madam," Yates said, stepping aside. "It's getting cold out there." "Thank you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Yates assured her. "We were just about to have supper. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join us." The woman hesitated, pride warring with necessity on her face before she finally nodded and stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin seemed to breathe new life into her, and she sighed gratefully. "I'm Yates Vance," he said, placing the rifle back in its position. "These are my children, Thomas and Lucy." The children regarded the stranger with curiosity but not fear. Yates had raised them to be wary but kind, essential qualities for survival on the frontier. "I'm Ruby Zimmerman," the woman replied, offering a small smile to the children. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Vance." "Just Yates, please. Take a seat by the fire, Miss Zimmerman. You look half frozen." "Ruby," she corrected, moving toward the hearth with visible relief. Yates returned to his meager meal preparation, now even more conscious of how little there was to go around. But something in him couldn't bear to send this woman back into the cold without nourishment, even if it meant his own hunger would continue. As he worked, Ruby gradually began to warm and Lucy approached her cautiously, offering her doll for inspection. To Yates's surprise, Ruby engaged with his daughter gently, admiring the doll and asking Lucy questions about her. Soon, Thomas joined them, and the cabin filled with the sound of children's voices, a sound that had been too rare lately. When Yates placed the simple meal on the table, cornmeal mush with bits of potato mixed in, he divided it into 3 portions, none for himself. Ruby noticed immediately. "Mr. Vance, Yates, you're not eating." "I had a big lunch in town," he lied, avoiding her gaze. Ruby looked at the food, then at the empty cupboards, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're giving me your portion." Yates shrugged, uncomfortable with her perception. "Please eat." "It's not much, but it's hot." The children had already begun eating, oblivious to the exchange between the adults. Ruby looked down at her bowl, then back at Yates, her eyes filled with emotion. "I can't take your food when you clearly have so little." "You can and you will," Yates said firmly. "No one goes hungry in my home if I can help it." Ruby seemed about to protest further, but instead picked up her spoon and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. Yates busied himself with mending a harness that had broken earlier that week, ignoring the gnawing in his own stomach. As the meal concluded, Ruby insisted on helping clean up. While the children played by the fire, she approached Yates with determination in her eyes. "I noticed your fields on my way in," she said. "They look like they could use some tending." Yates bristled slightly. "Been a dry year. And I've been working cattle drives to make ends meet. Haven't had much time for the farm." Ruby nodded, not backing down. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I know a thing or two about crops, even in drought conditions." "Is that so?" Yates asked, curious despite himself. "Yes. And I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Vance. I'm proposing an exchange, a place to stay for a few days, and in return, I'll help with your farm and the children." Yates studied her face, looking for signs of deception but finding only earnest determination. Still, he hesitated. A single man taking in an unmarried woman would set tongues wagging in granite, not that he cared much for town gossip. But there were practical concerns as well. "Miss Zimmerman, Ruby," he corrected. "I appreciate the offer, but I can barely feed my own children, let alone another mouth." "I'm not asking to be fed," she insisted. "I have skills beyond farming. I can sow, cook, preserve food. I noticed wild herbs growing on my way here that could supplement your meals." And she added, lowering her voice, "I have a small amount of money saved. Not much, but enough to help with provisions until you receive your payment." Yates felt a mixture of pride and desperation warring within him. The thought of accepting money from this woman who clearly had so little herself stung his pride. But one look at Thomas and Lucy, growing thinner by the day, made him reconsider. "1 week," he finally said. "You can stay 1 week, but I won't take your money. We'll manage with what we have." Ruby's smile transformed her face, revealing a beauty that hardship had temporarily obscured. "Thank you, Yates. You won't regret it." That night, Ruby slept in Yates's bed while he made do with a pallet near the fire. As he drifted off to sleep, stomach empty but mind full of unexpected hope, Yates couldn't help wondering about the mysterious woman who had appeared on his doorstep, like an answer to an unspoken prayer. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with frost clinging to the sparse grass surrounding the cabin. Yates rose before dawn, as was his habit, and was surprised to find Ruby already awake, stoking the fire and heating water. "You're up early," he remarked, reaching for his boots. "Farm life," she replied with a small smile. "Early to bed, early to rise." "I need to check on the livestock," Yates said. "It won't take long. I'll have coffee ready when you return," Ruby promised, "and perhaps something more substantial than last night's meal." Yates raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. Outside, the air was sharp in his lungs as he made his way to the small barn where their milk cow, 2 horses, and half a dozen chickens resided, all that remained of what had once been a modest but respectable farm. He milked the cow, a brown Jersey named Bessie, collecting barely enough milk to fill a small pail. The drought had affected her production, and Yates worried about what would happen when winter truly set in. The chickens had provided no eggs for 3 days, another worrying sign. When he returned to the cabin, the children were awake, and the small space was filled with an aroma that made his stomach growl audibly. Ruby stood at the small stove, stirring something in his cast iron pot. "What's that smell?" he asked, setting down the milk pail. Ruby turned, a hint of triumph in her expression. "Breakfast. I woke early and gathered some things." On the table sat a small pile of wild onions, dandelion greens, and what looked like mushrooms. Next to them was a rabbit, already skinned and cleaned. "Where did you get that?" Yates asked, stunned. "I found a snare line on my way here yesterday. Belonged to someone who hasn't checked it in days, based on the condition of the other catches. This one was fresh, though. I reset the snare as a courtesy." Yates wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned by her resourcefulness. "That's probably Old Man Jenkins's line. He doesn't get out much anymore." "Well, he'll find his snare reset and ready for the next catch," Ruby said. "I hope he doesn't mind that I took one." Necessity sometimes overrules propriety. Yates couldn't argue with that, and the rabbit stew she was preparing, enriched with wild foraged greens and the last of his cornmeal formed into dumplings, was the most substantial meal his family had seen in weeks. After breakfast, Ruby insisted on taking stock of the farm's resources while Yates tackled necessary repairs to the barn roof. To his surprise, she didn't shy away from hard work, rolling up her sleeves and diving into tasks that needed attention. By midday, she had organized their meager pantry, gathered more wild greens, and even managed to coax 2 eggs from the reluctant hens. "You have a way with animals," Yates commented as they paused for a simple lunch of leftover stew. Ruby shrugged. "They respond to patience and gentle handling. Your chickens just needed some attention." Throughout the day, Yates found himself watching Ruby interact with his children. Thomas, normally reserved with strangers, had taken to following her around, asking questions about plants and animals. Lucy had attached herself to Ruby's side, helping in whatever small ways a 4-year-old could manage. It was the most animated Yates had seen his children in months, perhaps even since their mother's passing. The realization brought a mixture of gratitude and guilt: gratitude for Ruby's presence, and guilt that he hadn't been able to provide this kind of attention himself. That evening, after the children were asleep, Yates and Ruby sat by the fire, the only sound the occasional pop and crackle of burning wood. "You've been a godsend today," Yates said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "The children haven't been this lively in a long time." Ruby gazed into the flames. "They're wonderful children. You've done well with them, especially given the circumstances." "I've done my best," Yates admitted, "but it's not been enough lately." Ruby turned to face him, her expression serious. "May I speak plainly, Yates?" He nodded, curious. "Your farm has potential, even in these conditions. The soil here is better than you think. With the right crops and techniques, you could make it productive again." "Farming takes time," Yates said. "Time I don't have if I'm going to feed my children now." "That's why you need help," Ruby said simply. "At least until you can get things running properly again." Yates studied her face in the firelight. "Why are you doing this? You're a stranger passing through, yet you're investing yourself in my family's problems." Ruby was quiet for a long moment. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild, and sometimes the kindness of strangers is the only thing that gets you through." There was a story there, Yates knew, but he didn't press. Everyone on the frontier carried their burdens, their secrets. If Ruby wanted to share hers, she would in her own time. "What were you heading to Granite for?" he asked instead. "Work," Ruby replied. "I heard the hotel was looking for a cook, and I've done that kind of work before." "Mrs. Peterson runs the hotel," Yates said. "She's a fair employer, but the pay isn't much." "At this point, any pay is better than none," Ruby said with a small smile. "But that can wait a few days while I help you get things in order here." Yates wanted to protest, to insist that he didn't need charity, but the truth was, he did need help. And Ruby wasn't offering charity, she was offering partnership, at least temporarily. "Thank you," he said simply. Ruby nodded, and they lapsed into silence again, both watching the dancing flames and contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken. The next few days fell into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Yates continued with necessary repairs around the farm while also hunting to supplement their meals. Ruby, true to her word, began working on the neglected fields, showing Yates how certain crops could still thrive even in the dry conditions. "Beans and squash," she explained as they worked side by side, preparing a small plot for planting. "They'll grow even now, and they put nutrients back in the soil for spring planting." Yates was skeptical but willing to try. Ruby had produced seeds from her small satchel apparently. She carried them everywhere, a habit from her farming days. "Seeds are life," she'd said simply when he'd questioned it. "And they don't weigh much." By the fourth day of Ruby's stay, the cabin had transformed. It wasn't just cleaner and more organized, it felt like a home again. Small touches, wildflowers on the table, reorganized furniture to create more space, mended curtains had breathed new life into the place. More importantly, the children were thriving under her attention. Ruby taught Thomas how to identify useful wild plants and showed Lucy how to make simple dolls from corn husks, skills passed down from her own mother. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Yates and Ruby would sit by the fire and talk. Gradually, pieces of Ruby's story emerged. She'd been married to a farmer in Missouri, but the war had taken him, along with their farm, when she couldn't keep up the payments. She'd been traveling west ever since, taking work where she could find it. "I'm sorry about your husband," Yates said one evening. Ruby nodded, her expression distant. "Frank was a good man, but that was years ago now. Life continues whether we want it to or not." Yates understood that sentiment all too well. "Margaret, my wife, she loved this place, saw potential in it that I sometimes missed. She'd be pleased to see what you're doing with it." Ruby smiled softly. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," Yates agreed, memories washing over him not with the sharp pain they once had, but with a gentle warmth. "But enough about the past. What's your plan once you reach Granite?" Ruby hesitated. "Find work, save money, perhaps eventually buy a small piece of land. I miss having roots." "Roots are important," Yates agreed, thinking of his own determination to keep this farm despite its challenges because it was the only home his children had known. On the morning of the 7th day, the day Ruby had agreed to stay, until Yates found himself dreading her departure. In just a week, she had become an integral part of their small family's routine. The thought of returning to their life before her arrival filled him with a heaviness he hadn't expected. When he entered the cabin after his morning chores, Ruby was at the stove, preparing a breakfast of porridge enriched with dried berries she discovered stored in the root cellar, apparently overlooked during Yates's inventory. "Good morning," she greeted him, her smile warm. "The children are just washing up outside." Yates nodded, trying to find the right words. Ruby, about today, she turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Yes, today marks a week." "It does," Yates confirmed, suddenly finding it difficult to maintain eye contact. "But I was hoping, actually, that you might consider staying a bit longer." Ruby's eyes widened slightly. "Yates, not indefinitely," he clarified quickly. "Just until the beans and squash are established, and maybe to help with planning for spring planting. Of course, I'd pay you from my cattle drive earnings when they come through." Ruby's expression softened. "You don't need to pay me, Yates. The food and shelter have been payment enough." But she hesitated. What would people in town think? A single woman living with a widower and his children, it could cause talk. Yates hadn't considered the propriety of the arrangement, focused as he had been on the practical benefits of Ruby's continued presence. "You're right," he admitted. "I hadn't thought of that. Perhaps we could present you as a hired housekeeper. It's not uncommon for widowers to employ help with children." Ruby considered this. That might work for a short time at least, but eventually I do need to find steady employment. Of course, Yates agreed, relief washing over him. So you'll stay, at least for now, Ruby smiled, and Yates was struck again by how it transformed her face, revealing the woman she must have been before hardship had worn her down. I'll stay, she said, at least until those beans sprout. The arrival of Yates's payment from the cattle drive a few days later brought a much-needed infusion of resources to the farm. He rode into Granite to collect it, returning with flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that had been missing from their pantry for too long. The town had buzzed with curiosity about the woman staying at the Vance farm. Yates had stuck to their agreed-upon story, describing Ruby as a hired housekeeper helping with the children and the farm. Most seemed to accept this explanation, though Mrs. Peterson from the hotel had given him a knowing look that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Hired help usually doesn't transform a man the way this one seems to have done, she'd remarked cryptically as Yates purchased supplies at her husband's general store. Yates had chosen to ignore the comment, but on the ride home he found himself reflecting on it. Had he changed? And if so, how was it visible to others? When he arrived home, the answer became clear. The sight of Ruby kneeling in the garden with the children, all three of them laughing as they tended the newly planted seeds, filled him with a warmth he'd thought he might never feel again after Margaret's passing. It wasn't just that Ruby had brought organization and skill to their struggling farm. She had brought joy back into their home, a gift more precious than any material improvement. As autumn deepened, Ruby's presence at the Vance farm began to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a natural part of their lives. The beans and squash had sprouted, defying Yates's initial skepticism, and Ruby had started preparations for a more substantial garden come spring. More significantly, she had begun teaching Yates about crop rotation, soil enrichment with natural materials, and water conservation techniques she'd learned from her father, a successful farmer despite challenging conditions. "The land will give back what you put into it," she explained one evening as they reviewed her plans for the farm, "but you have to understand what it needs." Yates found himself impressed not just by her knowledge but by her vision. Where he had seen only struggle and barely managed survival, Ruby saw potential and future prosperity. The children had blossomed under her care as well. Thomas, once quiet and withdrawn, now eagerly shared his daily discoveries and asked endless questions about farming and nature. Lucy had attached herself to Ruby completely, following her like a shadow and soaking up her gentle guidance. One evening in late October, as the first truly cold weather settled over the region, Yates returned from checking the property boundaries to find Ruby teaching the children to read by firelight, using an old Bible as their text. "And God said, 'Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind,'" Lucy carefully recited, her small finger tracing the words on the page. "Very good," Ruby praised. "Now, Thomas, continue from there." The scene struck Yates with such powerful emotion that he remained in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the woman who had so unexpectedly changed their lives. In that moment, he recognized what his heart had been trying to tell him for weeks. He was falling in love with Ruby Zimmerman. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. He had never expected to love again after Margaret had resigned himself to raising his children alone while keeping her memory alive. And yet, here was this remarkable woman who had walked into their lives when they needed her most, asking nothing but giving everything. What would Margaret think? The question arose unbidden in his mind. But as he watched Ruby with his children, her patience, her kindness, her obvious affection for them, Yates believed he knew the answer. Margaret had always wanted what was best for their family, even above her own happiness. She would want them to be whole again, to thrive rather than merely survive. "Pa," Thomas suddenly noticed him. "Miss Ruby is teaching us about creation and how it relates to farming. Is that so?" Yates said, entering the warm circle of firelight. Sounds like an important lesson. It is, Lucy confirmed seriously. Miss Ruby says we're partners with God when we farm, helping things grow like he intended. Ruby looked up at Yates, a slight blush coloring her cheeks at being caught in such a moment of intimacy with his children. I hope you don't mind. The Bible was in your trunk, and I thought reading practice would be beneficial. I don't mind at all, Yates assured her, settling into a chair. Margaret would have done the same. Something passed between them, then an understanding, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the growing bond that neither had yet put into words. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Yates found Ruby sitting on the small porch of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, gazing at the stars that blanketed the clear Arizona sky. "May I join you?" he asked. She nodded, shifting to make room on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sound the distant howl of a coyote and the soft whisper of the wind through the scrub brush. "The children are making remarkable progress with their reading," Yates said finally. "They're bright, both of them," Ruby replied. "You should be proud." "I am," Yates agreed, "and grateful to you for taking such an interest in their education. It's something I've neglected, I'm afraid, in the struggle just to keep food on the table." Ruby turned to look at him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. "You've done the best you could, Yates. No one could ask for more." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But your coming here has shown me how much more is possible, even with limited resources." Ruby smiled softly. "That's kind of you to say. It's the truth," Yates insisted. "You've transformed this place and us in ways I never imagined possible." Ruby looked away, seeming suddenly uncomfortable with his praise. "I should check on the beans tomorrow. This cold snap might affect them." Yates recognized her deflection but didn't press. Instead, he said, "Ruby, we need to talk about what happens next." She tensed beside him. "Next? It's been nearly a month since you arrived, far longer than the week we initially agreed upon." "I can leave if you want," Ruby said quickly. "Now that things are more organized, you could manage." "That's not what I'm saying at all," Yates interrupted, turning to face her fully. "I don't want you to leave, ever." Ruby's eyes widened, the moonlight reflecting in them like twin stars. "Yates, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that in just a few short weeks, you've become essential to me," Yates said, his voice low and earnest. "The children adore you, the farm is prospering under your care, and I—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I find myself thinking about you in ways I never expected to think about any woman after Margaret." Ruby's breath caught audibly. "Yates, you don't need to say anything now," he assured her. "I know it's sudden and perhaps unwelcome. But I wanted you to know that there's a place for you here, permanently, if you want it." Ruby was silent for so long that Yates began to fear he'd made a terrible mistake, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I came to your door that night, I was at the end of my rope. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the prospect of work in granite was my last hope. I never expected." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I never expected to find a home again. After Frank died and I lost our farm, I resigned myself to a life of transience. But here, with you and the children, I've found something I thought was lost to me forever." Hope surged in Yates's chest. "And what is that? Purpose," Ruby said simply. "Connection. The feeling that I belong somewhere with people who need me as much as I need them." "We do need you," Yates confirmed. "More than I can express." Ruby turned to face him fully, her expression serious in the moonlight. "But Yates, I need to be sure this isn't just gratitude on your part. I couldn't bear it if you felt obligated to me because I helped when things were difficult." Yates shook his head firmly. "It's not gratitude, though I am grateful. It's admiration, respect, and yes, something deeper that's growing every day." Ruby's expression softened, vulnerability replacing caution. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us. But I've learned to be careful with my heart." "As have I," Yates said. "Which is why I'm certain about this. I wouldn't risk disrupting the children's lives or yours if I wasn't. They gazed at each other in the moonlight, the weight of possibilities hanging between them. Then slowly, Yates reached out and took Ruby's hand in his. It was rough from work, like his own, but it fit perfectly in his grasp. "I'm not asking for immediate answers," he said. "Just for you to consider staying, not as our housekeeper, but as part of our family. In whatever capacity feels right to you." Ruby's fingers tightened around his. "I'll consider it," she promised. "But Yates, we should take this slowly, for the children's sake as well as our own. They've already lost one mother. I wouldn't want them to become attached to me and then be hurt if things don't work out between us." "You're right," Yates agreed, though part of him wanted to argue that the children were already attached, as was he. But Ruby's caution was one of the qualities he admired in her: her thoughtfulness, her consideration for others above her own desires. "For now," Ruby continued, "perhaps we should simply acknowledge that there's something growing between us, something worth exploring carefully." "I can accept that," Yates said, relieved that she hadn't rejected the possibility outright. "And in the meantime, those beans need tending, the children need teaching, and winter is coming. We have plenty to occupy us." Yates smiled, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. "You're a practical woman, Ruby Zimmerman." "One has to be to survive on the frontier," she replied, but her smile took any sting out of the words. They sat together a while longer, watching the stars and contemplating the future, no longer separate journeys but potentially a shared path. When they finally returned inside, something had shifted between them. A door opened that could not be closed again. As winter settled over Granite, bringing cold winds and occasional snow flurries, but little of the moisture the land so desperately needed, life at the Vance farm fell into a new rhythm. Ruby's initially temporary presence had become a fixture, and though they had agreed to move slowly in their personal relationship, their partnership in running the farm and raising the children had solidified. To the townspeople of Granite, the arrangement remained that of employer and housekeeper, though a few, like Mrs. Peterson, clearly suspected there was more between them. Yates found he cared little for gossip. What mattered was the flourishing of his family and their land under Ruby's influence. The week before Christmas, Yates made a trip into town to sell some of the preserves Ruby had made from wild fruits and the late squash harvest. The extra income, modest though it was, would allow him to purchase small gifts for the children and for Ruby, though he kept that plan to himself. At the general store, Mr. Peterson was in an unusually talkative mood. "Heard your place is looking mighty improved these days, Vance," he remarked as he tallied Yates's purchases. "That housekeeper of yours must be a wonder." "She has a gift for making things grow," Yates replied noncommittally. Peterson nodded. "My wife says she's got a gift for making more than plants flourish. Says the Vance children are looking healthier and happier than they have since their mother passed." "No offense meant," he added hastily. "None taken," Yates assured him. "It's true. Miss Zimmerman has been good for the children." Peterson leaned across the counter, lowering his voice confidentially. "Word is, she's been good for you too, Vance, and there's no shame in that. A man needs a woman's touch around the place, especially with little ones to raise." Yates felt a flush creeping up his neck but maintained his composure. "Miss Zimmerman is an excellent housekeeper and teacher to my children." Of course," Peterson said, a knowing twinkle in his eye. "Though if you're planning on making that arrangement more permanent, you might want to do it sooner rather than later. Mrs. Peterson mentioned that the new doctor in town has been asking about your Miss Zimmerman. Seems he saw her at church last Sunday and was quite taken." A sudden, unexpected surge of jealousy caught Yates off guard. He hadn't considered that Ruby might attract attention from other men, though in retrospect, it seemed obvious she would. She was beautiful, intelligent, and skilled. Any man would be fortunate to have her interest. "I'll keep that in mind," Yates said, keeping his tone neutral as he collected his purchases. On the ride home, Peterson's words gnawed at him. The thought of Ruby being courted by the town doctor, a man who could offer her security and comfort that Yates's struggling farm could not fill him with a cold dread. Yet what right did he have to stand in the way of her chances for a better life? When he arrived home, the sight that greeted him banished his dark thoughts temporarily. Ruby and the children were decorating the cabin for Christmas, using pine boughs, red berries, and homemade paper ornaments to transform the simple space into something festive and warm. Pa! Lucy cried, running to him with a paper star in her hands. Look what Miss Ruby helped me make for the top of our tree. Yates lifted his daughter, examining the carefully cut star with exaggerated attention. It's the finest star I've ever seen, Miss Lucy, fit for the angels themselves. Thomas approached more sedately, proudly displaying a small nativity scene he'd carved under Ruby's guidance, using the whittling skills Yates had begun teaching him. This is remarkable, son, Yates said, genuinely impressed by the boy's craftsmanship. You've got a real talent. Miss Ruby says I have steady hands like you, Pa, Thomas replied, beaming at the praise. Yates looked up to find Ruby watching them, a soft smile on her face as she hung the last of the pine boughs above the fireplace. The domesticity of the scene struck him forcefully. This was what a home should feel like, what he'd feared his children would never know again after Margaret's death. Could he really risk losing this? Losing her? That evening, after the children were asleep, their excitement for Christmas finally exhausted, Yates and Ruby sat by the fire, each working on secret projects for the children's presents, Yates carving a new doll for Lucy, and Ruby sewing a leather pouch for Thomas's growing collection of interesting stones and feathers. The cabin looks wonderful, Yates said, breaking the comfortable silence. The children haven't been this excited about Christmas since, well, in a long time. Ruby smiled, her nimble fingers continuing their work. They deserve some joy. All children do, but especially those who have known loss. As do adults who have known loss, Yates said quietly, watching her face in the firelight. Ruby glanced up, something vulnerable in her expression. Yes, I suppose we do. Yates set aside his carving and took a deep breath. Ruby, there's something I need to ask you. She set down her sewing, giving him her full attention. What is it? Peterson mentioned today that the new doctor in town has been asking about you. Apparently he saw you at church and was impressed. Ruby's eyebrows rose in surprise. Dr. Mills. He spoke to me briefly after the service, but it was merely polite conversation. Peterson seemed to think his interest might be more than polite, Yates continued, struggling to keep his tone neutral. And I realized that I have no right to stand in the way if you wish to explore such an opportunity. Ruby studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Are you asking if I'm interested in Dr. Mills's attention? I suppose I am, Yates admitted. He could offer you security, comfort, things my farm can't provide, at least not yet. Ruby set her sewing aside completely and leaned forward. Yates Vance, are you trying to give me permission to court another man? Put that way, it sounded absurd even to Yates's ears. I'm trying to do what's right by you, he said. To make sure you know that you have options beyond this hardscrabble farm and a widower with 2 children. I'm well aware of my options, Ruby said, a hint of fire in her tone. Do you really think I've stayed here all these weeks because I had nowhere else to go? Or that security and comfort are what I value most in life? Yates felt off balance, unsure how to respond. I just want what's best for you. And you believe you know what that is better than I do, Ruby challenged. No, of course not. Then perhaps you should ask me what I want rather than trying to decide for me, Ruby said, her voice softening though the intensity in her eyes remained. Humbled, Yates nodded. You're right. What do you want, Ruby? Ruby rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside him, taking his rough hands in hers. What I want, Yates Vance, is a life that has meaning. A place where I can put down roots and watch things grow, crops in the field, yes, but also children into adults, and perhaps most importantly, love between 2 people who understand loss and value what they've found in each other. Hope bloomed in Yates's chest, warm and expanding. And you believe you can find that here? With us? I already have, Ruby said simply. The question is whether you're ready to take the next step or if you're still too afraid of losing again to embrace what's right in front of you. The challenge in her words struck Yates to his core. Was that what he'd been doing, pushing her toward another man because he feared the pain of potential loss? "I'm not afraid of loving you," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease once he allowed himself to speak them. "I'm afraid of failing you, as I sometimes feel I failed Margaret by not being able to save her from the fever." Ruby's expression softened with understanding. "You didn't fail her, Yates. Some things are beyond our control. But what is within our control is how we choose to live now, whether we embrace joy when it's offered or push it away out of fear." Yates reached out, gently touching her cheek. "When did you become so wise, Ruby Zimmerman?" She leaned into his touch, a small smile playing at her lips. "Hardship either breaks you or teaches you, I've found. I prefer the lessons to the breaking." In that moment, looking into her eyes by firelight, Yates made his decision. He leaned forward and kissed her gently, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded, her hands moving to his shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Ruby. I should have said it weeks ago." "I love you too," she whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere, not to Dr. Mills or anyone else. My place is here if you'll have me, if I'll have you," Yates repeated, incredulous. "Ruby, you're the greatest blessing this farm, this family has ever known. The question is whether you'll have us with all our challenges and imperfections." "I already do," Ruby assured him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your challenges are mine now, as are your joys." Yates pulled her close again, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms, as if she'd been made to be there. "Then stay," he murmured against her hair. "Not as our housekeeper, but as my wife, the children's mother, the heart of this home." Ruby drew back slightly, her expression serious despite the joy in her eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you, Yates Vance?" "I am," he confirmed, suddenly certain it was the right thing, the only thing. "Though I don't have a ring to offer you yet." Ruby laughed softly. "Do you think I care about a ring? I've seen what you offer, Yates, a good heart, strong hands, and a love for your children that humbles me. That's worth more than any gold band." "Nevertheless," Yates said, "you deserve the proper asking, down on one knee and all." He slid from his chair to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "Ruby Zimmerman, will you marry me? Will you join your life with mine, help me raise these children, and build a future on this land together?" Ruby's smile was radiant, transforming her face in the way Yates had come to cherish. "Yes, Yates Vance. With all my heart, yes." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Inside the Vance cabin, warmth and excitement filled the air as Thomas and Lucy woke early, eager to discover what gifts the holiday might bring. Yates and Ruby had prepared simple but thoughtful presents for each child, the carved doll and leather pouch they'd worked on together, along with candy from town, new mittens Ruby had knitted in secret, and a book of children's stories Yates had found at Peterson's store. The children's delight in these modest offerings warmed Yates's heart, particularly when he compared this Christmas to the previous one, when grief had still hung heavy over their household. But the greatest gift was yet to be given. After the children had opened their presents and eaten the special breakfast Ruby had prepared, biscuits with honey and dried fruit, Yates cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Thomas, Lucy, Miss Ruby and I have something important to tell you," he began, reaching for Ruby's hand. The children looked up curiously, Thomas with a slightly wary expression that suggested he recognized the seriousness of the moment. "Miss Ruby has agreed to stay with us permanently," Yates continued. "In fact, she's agreed to become my wife and your new mother if you'll have her." There was a moment of stunned silence, then Lucy launched herself at Ruby with a squeal of delight. "You're going to be our mama." Ruby caught the little girl in her arms, hugging her close. "If that's what you'd like, sweetheart. I could never replace your mother, but I would be honored to be your mama now." Thomas remained seated, his expression more complex. Yates watched his son anxiously, knowing that at 6 Thomas had clearer memories of Margaret than Lucy did. "Thomas," Yates prompted gently. "How do you feel about this, son?" Thomas looked from Yates to Ruby, his young face serious. "Does this mean you won't leave us? Ever?" Ruby met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what it means, Thomas. I'm promising to stay with you through good times and hard times." "Like Mama promised, but then she got sick," Thomas said, the hurt of that broken promise unintentional though it was evident in his voice. Ruby moved to kneel before him, still holding Lucy. "Your mama didn't want to leave you, Thomas. Sometimes terrible things happen that we can't control. I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that as long as I'm able, I'll be here for you and Lucy and your pa." Thomas considered this, then asked, "And you'll still teach me about plants and animals?" "Every day," Ruby assured him, "and read to us at night." "Absolutely." Thomas nodded, decision made. "Then I think it's a good idea." He paused, then added shyly, "I'd like having a mama again." Ruby opened her free arm and Thomas moved into her embrace, allowing himself to be held alongside his sister. Over their heads, her eyes met Yates's, filled with such love that it nearly took his breath away. In that moment, watching the woman he loved holding his children, Yates felt a sense of completeness he'd thought lost forever. This was what it meant to have a full table, not just food to sustain the body, but love to nourish the soul. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Granite. Most responses were positive. The townsfolk had observed the improvement in the Vance family's circumstances and generally approved of the match. A few raised eyebrows at the speed of the courtship, but as Mrs. Peterson pointed out to her more judgmental friends, "When you get to our age, you realize life's too short to waste time when you found the right person." Yates and Ruby decided on a simple ceremony in early January, seeing no reason to delay once they'd made their decision. The local preacher, Reverend Howard, agreed to officiate, and Mrs. Peterson insisted on hosting a small reception at the hotel afterward. "It'll be the first wedding we've had in Granite since the miller's girl married that cattle rancher last spring," she declared. The town could use a celebration. On their wedding day, a rare winter rain fell, gentle but persistent, the kind that sinks deep into the soil rather than running off. Ruby, dressed in a new blue dress that Mrs. Peterson had helped her alter from one of her own, declared it a good omen. "Rain on your wedding day means fertility and cleansing," she told Yates as they prepared to leave for the church. "A washing away of past sorrows and the promise of new growth." Yates, handsome in his best shirt and newly polished boots, smiled at his bride-to-be. "I don't need omens to know our future is bright, but I'll take the rain as a gift for the farm." The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Thomas stood proudly at his father's side, taking his role as best man with utmost seriousness. Lucy scattered wildflower petals Ruby had dried months earlier, beaming with importance as she preceded Ruby down the short aisle of the small church. When Reverend Howard pronounced them husband and wife, and Yates kissed Ruby for the first time as her husband, the small gathering of townspeople erupted in applause and cheers. Among them were faces that had become friends over the difficult years, the Petersons. Old Jenkins, who taught Yates about cattle when he first arrived in the territory. The school teacher, Miss Winters, who had promised to take Thomas and Lucy once the spring term began. The celebration at the hotel was modest by Eastern standards, but felt extravagant to Yates' real coffee. A cake Mrs. Peterson had baked herself. Even a small band of local musicians who played for dancing. Watching Ruby twirl with Thomas, then Lucy, her face alight with joy, Yates felt a contentment so deep it bordered on disbelief. How had his life transformed so completely in just a few months? Later, when they returned to the farm, their home now, truly theirs together, Yates carried Ruby across the threshold as tradition demanded, despite her laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Humor me," he said, setting her down gently in the main room, which the children had decorated with more pine boughs and candles before going to stay the night with the Petersons. It's not every day a man gets to carry his bride home. Ruby looked around at the simple cabin, transformed by love and care from a place of mere survival to a true home. "It's perfect," she said softly. "All of it." Yates drew her into his arms, marveling again at how right it felt to hold her. "You're what's perfect, Ruby Vance." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Yates murmured, before claiming her lips in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The years that followed their marriage brought both challenges and joys to the Vance family. The drought eventually broke, and under Ruby's careful stewardship, the farm began to prosper. They expanded their crops, added more livestock, and built a larger barn to accommodate the growth. Thomas and Lucy thrived with the stability Ruby brought to their lives. Thomas developed a serious interest in botany, encouraged by Ruby's knowledge and the books Yates ordered for him from back east. Lucy revealed a talent for art, filling sketchbooks with drawings of the farm, the animals, and her family. 2 years after their wedding, Ruby gave birth to a son they named Samuel. The following year brought another addition, a daughter they called Emma. The cabin, once so empty and echoing with loss, now bustled with the energy of 4 children and the love that bound them all together. As Samuel's first birthday approached, Ruby found Yates sitting on the porch one evening, gazing at the thriving fields that stretched before them. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him. Yates smiled, drawing her close. "I was just thinking about the day you appeared at our door. How close we came to never meeting. If you'd taken a different path, if I'd been less willing to share what little we had." Ruby nodded, understanding. "Life turns on such small moments, doesn't it? A meal offered, a kindness extended." "The best decision I ever made was inviting you in that night," Yates said. "Even when I had nothing to give, somehow giving it anyway brought everything back to us tenfold." Ruby rested her head on his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. "You gave me more than a meal that night, Yates. You gave me hope when I'd almost lost it, a chance to belong somewhere again. And you've filled our table ever since," Yates said. "Not just with food, though God knows we eat better than we ever did before you came, but with love and laughter and purpose." Inside the house, they could hear the children, Thomas reading to Lucy and Samuel, Emma cooing in her cradle. The sounds of family, of home, of a legacy being built day by day. "Remember what you said about seeds?" Yates asked. "That their life and they don't weigh much," Ruby smiled at the memory. "I do." "You were the seed our family needed," Yates said. "Small enough to fit in the palm of my hand that first night, but containing all the potential for the life we've grown together." Ruby turned to face him, her eyes shining in the fading light. "I love you, Yates Vance, more with each passing day. And I love you, Ruby Vance," he replied. "My partner, my heart, the woman who taught me that even in our darkest moments, sharing what little we have can lead to abundance beyond imagining." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in the peaceful quiet of evening, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and their love, a family and a farm, once struggling, now flourishing. A table that would always be full, for generations to come.